On the front lines, every decision matters. That's why Intel partnered with EdgeRunner AI to bring AI where and when our troops need it most. In the field, in real time. EdgeRunner's secure, domain-specific language model is optimized to run on Intel-powered devices, and it's built on Intel's 50-year commitment to advanced manufacturing right here on American soil. That's the power of Intel Inside. See what we can build together at intel.com/USAI.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. Angus Fletcher is an author and professor of story science at Ohio State University's Project Narrative, which he describes as the world's leading academic think tank for the study of how stories work. In his work as an academic, he says he's learned the human brain is not particularly data-driven or particularly logical. Instead, it's emotional and creative and powered by story. His work has led him to write new books of bedtime stories for children across the Arab world. He's also engineered an AI that's smart enough to know when it's dumb, he says. And he's empowered our military to solve the problem of war by imagining solutions to conflicts before they arise. And it's this latter point that brings us together today. Professor Angus Fletcher, welcome to Defense One Radio.
That's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Very good. Well, thank you for the extended work you've done over the last several decades. I'd like to begin by describing the Army training that you helped develop around intuition and imagination and common sense and emotional intelligence. Those are the four main kind of like ideas that kind of that undergird this particular book, Primal Intelligence, that we'll be talking about. And you said the Army came to you about your research and ideas, and that you didn't so much teach them as they untaught you. Can you explain? Like, how did that work?
The big picture is that I was contacted by U.S. Army Special Operations about 5 years ago because they wanted to, in the big picture, crack this problem that is called VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. It's a term I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. Basically, it's how do you act intelligently in low information environments and environments that are changing very rapidly, environments that are chaotic. And the challenge of these environments is that they're environments in which artificial intelligence and computers cannot function, because artificial intelligence computers are big data systems. They get smarter the more information that they have. The less information they have, the more fragile they get, the more prone they are to hallucination and misfire. Whereas certain humans can be very, very effective and very, very smart in these VUCA situations. And so the big question is how? How are those humans so able to act intelligently when they have very little information? So that was the big problem that caused RSOF and USASOC to knock on my door about 5 years ago. But the more specific problem, which I think you're alluding to in terms of getting into the weeds of how these organizations operate, the more specific problem is that starting in the early 2000s, and I should be clear here that I'm myself not a member of the Army, and so I'm just passing on what I have been told by the Army. Starting in the early 2000s, there was a need to train more special operators, both in terms of the Green Berets and the Army's two classified units at JSOC. And the reason that there was a need to train more operators is, first of all, the global war on terror, GWOT, was demanding ever more operators. There was a kind of increasing shift towards deploying operators as opposed to relying on conventional forces. So there was just a need for more operators. And at the same time that was happening, there was always also a recognition within RSOF's training pipelines that students, young people who were coming into these pipelines were showing less aptitude than previous generations of Americans had at certain core abilities, such as the ability to think intelligently in VUCA. And maybe later in our conversation, we can talk about why it is that the American school system is actually making it harder for students today to think in terms of volatility and complexity and ambiguity. But that was just the situation. And so basically, RSOF had this problem, which is that they were getting less and less young people who were sort of naturally gifted with or who had the skills necessary to be operators. And they needed to have more and more operators coming out the other side of the pipeline. And this put pressure on them because even though RSOF and its sort of training and selection pipelines like to think of themselves as having that training component, most people will tell you that they're actually historically much more focused on selection than on training. And so really what a lot of these elite pipelines do is they just identify people who already have the capacity to function at a high level, who have the skills, whether mental or physical, that are required by the special operations community. And there's less emphasis and less expertise in training people up who aren't already at that level. And so when I was approached by RSoft, they said, we're having this problem. We want to figure out a way to take more people who are below our threshold in terms of the ability to think intelligently in VUCA and lift them over that threshold. And we think that you, Professor Fletcher, because you have a very unusual theory of the human brain, might be the person to help us. So that's kind of the backstory about how RSoft approached me.
So now, what is this theory of the human brain, one, and then two, how did you apply that to the Army? That's what I'm kind of most intrigued by.
Yeah, so my theory of the human brain. Well, I should probably start out by telling people that even though I'm now currently housed in the English department, my background is in neurophysiology. I trained at the University of Michigan Medical School. And neurophysiology is basically the studying of living brains, how neurons interact. And while I was working in that laboratory, what I became fascinated by was the ability of humans to be intelligent in ways that computers could not, the ability of humans to think in ways that were different from computers. To be very simple about it, computers think in equations, and humans can think in actions. Actions and equations are different. We can get into that if you're interested. But the ability of humans to think in actions is what allows us to make plans. Because if you can string together a new sequence of actions, you've made a new plan. Well, another word for a plan is a plot, is a story. So a huge amount of human intelligence is driven by our ability to think in story. And that capacity is something that I would refer to as narrative cognition. Now, this was a big departure, both for a lot of my colleagues in the labs, but also to the general public. When the general public thinks about narrative, they think of it as a way of storytelling, as a way of communicating information. But I actually think of narrative as something that goes way back before language. We think that human language evolved maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe a little bit longer ago than that. It's hard to know. But narrative cognition is something that probably dates back hundreds of millions of years. It's something that we see in crows, that is to say, we see in birds. And crows and humans, our common ancestors, go back before the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So thinking in story, as opposed to communicating in story, is this really ancient capacity. But prior to me in my lab, nobody had really studied it because people thought of story as a form of communication, as a form of thinking. So for a long time, I sort of kicked along as a sort of eccentric outsider. But the Army came to me because they said, hey, Angus, we've been trying these other models of cognition, and they haven't been working, and they haven't been working for the reasons that you've predicted. So we're interested in trying your model of cognition. And we want to bring it in, and we want to try it with some of our elite teams and see if it works. And so the story of all of that and kind of the specifics of the theory and whatnot is all in the book. And we obviously don't have time to go to all of it now, but basically just to give you a sense of kind of how narrative works differently than how computers think in patterns. So the goal of a computer is to take a large amount of information and identify a set of correlations in there, which become a pattern. The way that narrative works is it identifies exceptions to rules. It identifies something that breaks your current mental frameworks. And the simple way of parsing this difference is to talk about the difference between probability and possibility. A probability is an event that has occurred repeated times before in the past, so you can develop a prediction of how likely it is to occur again in the future when the correlates of that event pop up again. A possibility is something that has never occurred before. It has never occurred before, but it isn't prohibited by the rules of your environment. So if you can imagine it, you can initiate it. And so story thinks in possibility, computers think in probability. Computers are very good at repeating the past when those past situations come up again. Computers are very good at snapping in an algorithm that was successful in those situations, but only humans are able to imagine possibilities that haven't occurred before. And that's why the human brain, because it thinks in story, can operate in VUCA, because VUCA is obviously a changing environment, a novel environment. It requires the invention of new plans, new plots, new stories. And so what we did is we started to go in with those teams and train up these parts of the brain that were not trained up in school, that were neglected by the modern world, and that start to atrophy when you interact too much with technology. And we started to train up those powers of the human brain. And once we did that, we saw that operators not only got faster at making plans under pressure, but were more able to respond to emergent opportunities, had lower anger, had lower anxiety, and were better able to process grief and other forms of trauma.
a lot of those things are obviously needed for the soldier who's seen in intense combat. You do remind me, in my exposure to special forces, there was a creative kind of outside the box attitude that almost all of them just by default had. If you're going to, you talked about the emphasis on the selection process. Thinking you want to be in special forces is obviously one thing. Training is the next step, but actually, of course, having the grit to make it through the selection process is another beast. It did remind me of the character of these folks. A lot of them were pretty good at humor and pretty good at improvising, kind of as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. So to your point, special operations has a history of selecting those individuals who are unconventional, who have that sense of humor, who have that willingness to defy authority, who are kind of outlaw good, I guess you would say. But the challenge is, what do you do when you don't have enough of those individuals? What do you do when you're looking around and you need to fill the team room and you've only got 6 or 7 guys and you need to fill up a full 12-man ODA? How do you take a general population that isn't unconventional in those ways? And when I was first brought in, the Army showed me their training deck for how they sort of, instill creativity in young recruits. And I believe I'm not disclosing any classified information here to reveal you that training deck consisted of a PowerPoint slide, which started with a cardboard box in the center of it. And then the next slide drew a circle outside that cardboard box. And then the final slide said, think outside the box. And that was the entire training.
Brilliant.
The entire training. And I was like, well, I mean, that's, of course, to someone who's creative, you get it immediately, right? You naturally know how to think outside the box. To somebody who doesn't have that ability, completely useless training. And so a big part of what we did with our team is we went in there, we threw out those slides, and we said, look, here's actual ways you can train these young recruits to be more creative without using a PowerPoint deck.
Fascinating. So quite a bit of your book, as you describe your work, sort of is spent in this fictional world called Pineland. The special forces do some training in this forested area of sort of like western central North Carolina. I visited Pineland back in 2012 for this audio report that I was had produced for North Carolina Public Radio back then, right when I was leaving the Army. They insisted that I get there at like 2 a.m. And I think they were just trying to make it difficult for me. How badly do you want this little guy? But I did experience that, got to meet some of the characters and got to be introduced to the fictional world of this whole story that they've created. I am wondering, did you implement any of this sort of stuff, or did you try to measure any of it in the Pineland scenario or within that? And what kind of things in Pineland did you learn that fit into your work?
Yeah, so I mean, Pineland itself is, of course, a huge open-ended exercise, so it's very difficult to do quantitative scientific research within Pineland. But to give you a couple ideas of kind of our jumping point, and then to give you a sense of how we work with the cadre to kind of learn and assess, what we know is that two things that are really, really good for the human brain in terms of stimulating creativity are travel and theater. And travel is good because it surrounds your brain with constantly new things, exceptions to your previous environment. And so it's constantly stimulating your imagination, stimulating your intuition. It's prompting you to imagine new possibilities, new things that could happen in this environment that couldn't happen in your home environment. And the reason that theater is so effective is because it releases you from the rules of your past character, your past history, to try and imagine yourself as other people and role play. What would I do if I was this person in this situation? What would I do if I was this person in that situation? And so the brilliant thing about Pineland, for people who haven't been able to experience it for themselves, is it essentially combines travel and theater by being this gigantic role-playing exercise, which is completely immersive, takes place in this sort of semi-surreal environment, which is influenced by the entire history of special operations. There's little pieces of Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq in there, as well as these kinds of post-apocalyptic scenes and bits of sci-fi and imagination. And so it's like traveling to a place you've never been before while everyone around you, and they have hundreds and thousands really of role players who are engaging in this kind of mass performance, so that you get kind of both aspects of that. So that's kind of like the big piece of sort of what's going on in Pineland. And then as far as the kind of thing that we're really interested in a lot of the areas where you can kind of practice and test things for Pineland. I think without giving away any secret information is what they call the MREs, which occur beforehand, the mission readiness exercises, and these are kind of local sort of small constrained examples of the kinds of problems or tests you might find in the open-ended experience of Pineland. And so again, I don't want to give away any of the specific ones, but there would be, maybe a little constrained scenario that you and your ODA could go through, you and your team, your A team could go through in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And it would allow you to repeat it maybe a couple times. So you could learn from that rather than when you're in Pineland, it's a kind of continuous narrative that you can't just stop and break and have the cadre come over and counsel you and learn from. So we worked a bit with the mission readiness exercises. And in particular, what we're really interested there is what happens when your plan is broken. So in other words, when you go into one of these mission readiness exercises, you're given a brief and you're told you've got to accomplish the following task. And so you do all this kind of background stuff and you think, oh, okay. And you go in there, and the moment you go in there, the situation shifts. You experience volatility, you experience uncertainty, you experience VUCA. And because the situation shifts, your plan breaks. The plan that you brought into that environment breaks. And the question is how quick can you get yourself out of that plan and get yourself into another plan? How quickly can you make a new plan that matches the evolving nature of your situation? And then as fast as you can do that, the cadre is going to try and break that next plan. They're going to say, oh, okay, you've come up with another good plan. We're going to break that too. And we're going to see how fast you can keep responding with new plans as we keep breaking your old plans. And the reason for that is because what the cadre is trying to teach you is to focus not on developing the plan, but on developing the planner. And what they're saying to you is because you came up with that one plan, you have this power, planning, that's going to allow you to make another plan. So shift your focus off that perfect plan you made last night, abandon that plan, and instead focus on your own ability to make a new plan. And the more that we get recruits into that psychology, the more successful they are on Pineland and the more successful they are on missions. And the reason it's really important to give them that is because in school today, you're taught the opposite. So if you go to any high school in America, what is the thing that you're taught? You're taught that there's an answer and the teacher has it. So rather than being told there's many possible answers and you can come up with them, you're taught there's one right answer and there's an authority who's going to correct you if you get it wrong. And if you have that psychology, then when you go into a fast-changing environment, you're going to freeze because you're going to be like, I don't know what the perfect answer is and there must be a perfect answer, and you're going to give up. Whereas if you have the Pineland psychology, which is there are many possible plans, and I'm a planner, and my job is always to come up with new plans as opposed to come up with the one right perfect plan, you're going to be able to adapt at the speed of life, and you're going to be able to handle whatever VUCA throws at you. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a big picture of the kind of stuff that we were training and assessing. And so basically, the assessment process comes down to how fast can you come up with new plans once your old plan is broken.
So you said once that special operators are just regular people who try harder. Do you think that's ultimately kind of at the core of your recent work? Almost something like stopping, slowing down, taking a breath, and consciously trying harder. I almost see what I would describe as a lot of like premise questioning and dilemma reframing in your writing for Primal Intelligence. I was wondering what you sort of think about that, because the Special Forces soldiers that I had run into, they worked their butts off, and it was like the expectation. And I did begin to wonder, I was like, so if you just consciously set yourself up to be like, I'm going to apply myself, more of myself, the most of myself, would that make you an operator? I mean, so what are your kind of thoughts about that aspect?
And this is something I haven't actually talked about before, but I'm happy to share it on the podcast, which is that when I first started working with the operators, before I met them, I was a little bit spooked and concerned about what would happen. And then after I sort of spent a kind of a week or so away from my family, kind of working in these environments, I came home and my wife was like, she's like, Angus, I've never seen you so relaxed. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, I've never seen you so relaxed. And what that made me realize is that what had occurred through working with the operators is that they had taught me to kind of accelerate my own thinking. They taught me to accelerate my own performance. And that just gave me this enormous confidence when I left that training environment and went anywhere else. And ever since then, I've realized that, they have this remarkable capacity to identify and accelerate the performance in almost anyone they interact with. And I think it's important to remember that the core function of teams, particularly like the Green Berets, is a force multiplier effect. And the purpose of the force multiplier effect is to basically turn everyone you encounter into an operator. And so I've experienced myself, I don't want to pretend that I'm an operator, but I've experienced myself the capacity of these teams and these individuals to accelerate and amplify the performance of everyone around them. So yes, I do believe it's possible for everyone to, if not literally become a Green Beret, I think it's possible for everyone to start to accelerate their performance in the way that operators do. And I also think that we have a very narrow understanding, I think particularly in the civilian world, of what an operator is. We have this imagination of an operator as someone's got like a big beard, a lot of arm tattoos, and it's kind of like physical machine, and is out there sort of, inflicting speed, surprise, and, violence upon our enemies. And yeah, of course, there's a direct assault, a direct action element to operations. But the key to an operator is, first of all, remembering that the ultimate weapon is the human brain. The human brain is a differentiator. So what you're really training up as an operator is your intelligence. And whether you're big, small, male, female, your brain has the capacity to be incredibly smart. The second thing is that really what defines an operator is the capacity for leadership, the ability to go first. That's what we really mean when we talk about someone who's unconventional. What we're saying is that they don't stick with the existing program. They're willing to venture beyond it to try new things. Not because they're contrarians necessarily, but because they realize that life is changing. And so you yourself have to be open and inventive and innovative. And so it's that capacity for leadership, I think, more than anything else that makes an operator. And one of the things that I've learned working in the operations community is that we all have that capacity for leadership inside us. In fact, it's our biological inheritance. If you go back 100,000 years, your ancestors, they'd be maybe in their mid-20s, and they'd be the oldest person in their community. They would be surrounded by environmental fragility, things going wrong. They'd have all these problems in terms of, famine and predators and all sorts of other things that they had to cope with. And they led their communities to victory, to safety, to be able to go on to the next generation. And all of us on the earth now are the inheritors of those leaders. We count all of them as our ancestors. And so all of us are born within us with the biological ability to lead, to step first, to be the first person in our community, to show everyone else the new path. And I think the problem with the modern world is because of our educational system and because of our dependence on technology, that is being habituated out of us. But we can all recover it. We can all become leaders. And because we can all become leaders, all of us have the capacity to operate in our own lives, even if we don't necessarily have the capacity to be Green Berets.
When I first started reading your book, a lot of it sounded almost like too fantastical, like too easy. And so I put it down for a short time. And in retrospect, many of the kind of things that you wind up elaborating on, one of the things you mentioned, for example, is like looking for or being open to positive life surprises. It reminds me of practices like fostering gratitude as like a daily habit. And for me, it's something that's both easy and hard at the same time, though in like very different ways. What are your thoughts on the gratitude, I guess, element?
Yes, let me talk about the gratitude thing, and then let me talk about the kind of fantastical nature of the book, because I agree with you. Actually, I'm good friends with Martin Seligman, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he actually texted me after he'd read the first chapter of the book and said, "Is this science fiction, or did this actually happen?" And it is actually a true story. Everything in it is true, but it does read at moments like a reality break. As far as gratitude goes, yes, a lot of what I talk about in the book is how a lot of these processes that we're already familiar with are incredibly powerful and effective, but we've just been using them wrong. So I'll give you an example with gratitude. In the modern world, we're taught to be grateful for nice things. We're taught that the purpose of gratitude is to pause and be thankful for all the wonderful things in our life, for our family, for this beautiful sunny day, for the food we have in front of us. In fact, that use of gratitude is very ineffective in the human brain. The human brain is unable to feel strong gratitude for positive things. And when we do attempt to practice gratitude for positive things, it does not really have a lasting effect on our brain or our performance. Instead, what has a tremendous effect on human performance is having gratitude for negative things. And the more you get yourself in the practice of being grateful for hard and challenging things, the more it stimulates intense growth in your brain. And this is something that's natural to special operators. I mean, a huge part of what special operators do all the time is they cherish discomfort. Uh, the most basic example of this is obviously in the gym. The harder you push yourself physically, the more pain you give yourself physically, the more gratitude you have for that pain, the more your body grows. But it's also true with anything in life. The more you embrace hard times as a source of growth, the more you say, thank you for giving me this challenging thing because it gave me strength and it gave me wisdom, the more that that gratitude in your brain powers this deep increase in your performance. And on a psychological level, without getting too technical about it, the reason for this is that within the human brain, the purpose of gratitude is actually to shift your focus away from yourself. And it's particularly to interrupt processes like rumination, which are these kinds of like inward looking processes where you have self-pity or other kinds of things like that. It's to shift it outward and to get us out of that kind of egocentric cycle into embracing the world around us. And so that's just kind of mini example of how a lot of what I do in the book is kind of walk through things that people are familiar with and then show them how they actually work differently if you think like an operator, or work differently if you activate your primal intelligence than you're sometimes taught in school. And, as far as the kind of fantastical part of the book, I hope that when people read it, they do feel at moments like they are unsticking from their reality. Because more than anything else, the key to activating this deep intelligence is to get back in touch with your imagination and to realize that a lot more things are possible in this life than you might think if you spend your life just watching YouTube or driving your car around the suburbs. There is an incredible amount of opportunity. If you went back 100 years and then look forward to the future, all the kind of extraordinary things that have happened, it would blow your mind 100 years ago if you went back 500 years ago. And same thing looking forward. There are going to be tremendous, incredible, revolutionary things, things that do not involve computers, but involve technologies that we haven't even begun to conceptualize yet. They're going to happen in the future. And it's the same with your regular life. There are remarkable things that you can do today, tomorrow, the next day, that break every precedent. And so when you read the book, I do hope it puts you in contact a little bit with that sense of, is this actually real? But it is real because life is always stranger than fiction.
Your comment about finding gratitude in the negative things reminded me of something that I had heard a year ago. There was this guy, it's about 60 or so, who teaches philosophy in Nevada, maybe at UNLV or something like that. His name is Bill Ramsey. But he also does rock climbing, and he's like pretty damn good. Climbs real hard. You got to work out a whole lot to be able to climb kind of at the level he does. So he came up with what he calls a pain box. And that is, you've got to focus on the pain from hard work and preparation and realize that that is a better pain than from failure to achieve your goals. It was kind of an interesting parallel to totally non-military almost application of some of these things. To continue to pivot away from this non-military consideration, I'm wondering, how is your work with summer camps progressing? I'm intrigued that you're taking this work of yours to the summer camp direction, but I'm wondering, how is that progressing? And can you get into a bit about why you broke away from trying to work in public education?
Yeah, so the work is going well. We're working formally with the American Camp Association, which is the largest overseer of all summer camps in America, oversees just a huge variety of different kinds of summer camps. And first of all, the initial reason to kind of start working with young people is because once I was working with the operators, I realized that the methods that we developed to help with the operations, the special operations training, would be even more useful if we started giving it to young people, because young people today are really struggling with high levels of anxiety, struggling with high levels of anger. They're suffering from low levels of self-efficacy and resilience. And all of this is because they find themselves unable to make plans. It's as simple as that. They are not taught in school how to make plans. They're taught that life is a multiple choice test and that they've got to find the right answer, as opposed to being taught life is a huge open environment and it's going to keep changing and you've got to figure out how to make plans. And so I realized if we can start helping these young people to make plans better, we can start getting them out of these fight or flight responses that they're experiencing in school. We can help them get out of the anxiety trap. We can get them out of the restlessness trap. And we can help them live happier, more resilient lives. And so We went back, we started introducing this into schools. We've done it with students as young as 8 years old, all the way down in third grade. And we've published peer-reviewed papers in which we've shown that it has a huge effect to train kids to think like Green Berets. It makes them feel much more empowered, able to deal with problems in their own lives, and helps them regulate their emotions much more effectively and just be happier. But the challenge, of course, is that even though I've gotten a lot of buy-in from my local school district here in Ohio, it's very, very hard to make structural and institutional changes in the American school system. It's a nest of competing interests and red tape, and every person you can imagine is out there now trying to change the school system. And as a result, there's no change happening. And that was when the American Camp Association approached me and they said, "Hey, Angus, it's really hard to change schools, but camps are really open. And camp can fill all that time outside of school. And so, kids can go to school and they can learn math in school, and there's nothing wrong with learning math. But outside of school, they can learn all these other skills through camp. They can embrace nature. They can discover the kind of volatility and uncertainty of these places. And they can also discover the nature within themselves. They can discover their capacity for self-reliance. They can discover their ability to make new plans when all of a sudden it starts to rain unexpectedly and they've got to build a shelter for themselves, or they're on the middle of a hike and something goes wrong, or they get lost and they've got to figure out a path back. These environments, these camp environments, can serve as a space for them to develop these emotional skills, these imaginative skills, and also help them develop their common sense. And so what we started doing is we started partnering with the American Camp Association to put this training into summer camps. We're rolling it out now. And, we're already starting to see early results. I don't have any sort of quantitative or scientific data for you, but you can probably imagine that if you train young people to do the same things that Green Berets are trained to do in Pineland, they'll develop that sense of self-efficacy, purpose, ability to respond to the unknown, ability to overcome challenges. That is the hallmark of a special operator.
Well, I'm intrigued to find out how it comes along. So I will be watching your work and your output for whatever and however long it takes to see some work there. My last question: how do you think as you put it, the artificial intelligence bubble fits into your work now and the sort of things that you are, trying to improve for society?
Yeah, so I have a long history of working with natural language processors, so almost a decade now. And these are the basis of what we now call LLMs, which are kind of the focus of a lot of the AI interest. People out there who are experts in AI will understand that LLMs are not equivalent to AI. They're a small area of AI. However, they have come to dominate the current consciousness of the moment. And they're particularly having a huge impact on our educational facilities. So here I'm a professor at Ohio State. We're one of the first universities in the world, I believe, to announce that all of our students will graduate with AI fluency, which is just the ability to understand how AI works, the ability to see whether it works or doesn't work for a particular problem, where it may be useful, where it may not be useful, starting to understand not just the software, but the underlying hardware behind all this stuff. So all educational institutions and all people, at least over the next couple of years, are going to have to grapple with AI. I do believe it's a bubble. I do believe we're at peak AI. I believe that a lot of this intensity is going to recede, but even so, it's still important to understand what this technology is. At the same time as we're understanding what AI is, it's also important to understand that because AI is eventually going to be everywhere, it's no longer going to be a kind of distinguishing feature. It's not going to set you apart from anybody else. What is going to set you apart? It's your ability to access your own unique human intelligence. And so the other thing that we're doing here at Ohio State is I've just been appointed the head of our business school's leadership institute. We've got about 7,000 undergraduate business majors under our purview. And we're going to start introducing this special operations training to those students. We're going to help them start training up their intuition, their imagination, their common sense, their ability to imagine and invent new plans and pick the right plan for the situation, their ability to analyze themselves and figure out what their own personal life purpose is. That is, in other words, to determine what their story is and what sets their story apart from others. And ultimately, we are going to help them become leaders, because that is the difference between humans and computers. Computers can be better managers than humans, but humans are always going to be the better leaders.
Angus Fletcher is an author and professor of story science at Ohio State University's Project Narrative. His latest book is Primal Intelligence, and I highly recommend it. Professor Fletcher, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening. And until next time.
On the front lines, every decision matters. That's why Intel partnered with EdgeRunner AI to bring AI where and when our troops need it most. In the field, in real time. EdgeRunner's secure, domain-specific language model is optimized to run on Intel-powered devices, and it's built on Intel's 50-year commitment to advanced manufacturing right here on American soil. That's the power of Intel Inside. See what we can build together at intel.com/USAI.